Mr. Ross?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Along with you, I've just heard a number of interesting perspectives, and I think what I'm going to offer is something that complements what you've heard. It doesn't necessarily agree with everything, but I think it is designed to create even more of a context, at least as it relates to the Middle East. I'm going to encapsulate what I wrote in my statement by talking about what I consider certain basic realities. One reality is a reality that confronted me on 9/11. I had all the questions I think that many of you are now exploring, among which, how is it possible that we could have been so catastrophically surprised? What fundamental assumptions were we making that were not the right assumptions, and how do we correct that, among other things? But I didn't have any questions about where this had come from. I had no doubt that this had a Middle Eastern connection. I understood very clearly that the kind of brand of radical Islam that tends to glorify martyrdom on the one hand and makes us the embodiment of evil, the source of contamination of the faith, responsible for corrupting their culture, in effect being responsible for supporting the intruder in their midst. All of these things combine to ensure that the kind of attack that we saw came from those who embrace this kind of radical Islam, and they're primarily in the Middle East. So I had no doubt that this is where the source of the terror came from. I also reacted at the time to some who said that, well, if we just had peace between Arabs and Israelis, and especially between Israelis and Palestinians, which is the core of that conflict, that basically we wouldn't have had this attack. Now, believe me on this one, no one has committed more of his time to trying to resolve this conflict than I have, and I remain as committed as ever. But you have to go back to where we were in the year 2000 to realize that in the midst of the planning for 9/11, we were at a point when most in the Arab world actually thought we were going to resolve this conflict. In fact, had we, the way most of them thought at that time, we still would have had 9/11, because in a sense, 9/11 wasn't about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. To be sure, the Israeli-Palestinian issue sours the climate. To be sure, especially with the advent of the Intifada, it did create more of a sense that somehow something had to be done. And the images of the Intifada that were being broadcast on Arab satellite TV, which was in effect re-Arabizing the Palestinian conflict, were the kind of images that were bound to add to the sense of anger and resentment. And anger and resentment is the essence of what people like Osama bin Laden and their organizations depend upon. They have to have anger and resentment. They have to have frustration. They have to have no hope to be able to build a body of recruits. And unfortunately, when it comes to the Middle East, they have very fertile ground, even if you didn't have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're talking about a landscape, at least psychically, that is characterized by a sense of humiliation, that is characterized by a sense of indignity, that is characterized by a sense of betrayal. And it goes back at least 80 years, actually longer. Part of it is the sense that what was once a glorious history is gone. Part of it is the sense of betrayal of promises that were made at World War I. It is interesting that in the very first videotape that Osama bin Laden released after 9/11, he referred to 80 years of humiliation. And he was in effect, at least implicitly, talking about the promises that had been betrayed after World War I when there was supposed to be independence for the Arabs. Well, not only did they not get the independence, but their image of having one Arab state, which was going to be the key to reestablishing their glory, was also frustrated. They were denied this. Again, they were betrayed. So the sense of betrayal has deep-seated roots in this part of the world. And the feeling that somehow there is an ongoing humiliation where the outside world has imposed on people in the Middle East that adds to that sense of indignity is also very much a part of that landscape. Now, the imposition is not only what is done from the outside, it's also what's done from the inside. Today in the Arab world, the feeling is that most are imposed on by their own regimes. And that too adds to their sense of anger and frustration. Now, the fact is, this creates a context. It also creates a context where in the current setting, most regimes don't address the anger and frustration, they try to deflect it. They want to make somebody else responsible for these ills. And indeed, when you have a history where you can refer to betrayals, it's always easy to do so. And unfortunately, some of our friends are in the lead, at least in terms of what they allow to be said within their societies, as a way of deflecting anger away from them and on towards us. Now, 9/11 in some respects did create a watershed in the region, at least in terms of some of the liberal voices. They became stronger after 9/11 in terms of calling for a kind of introspection, in terms of saying that, you know, it's not necessarily the Americans who are to blame. Some of these observers, some of these Arab liberals, some of these Arab reformers began to say, we need our religious authorities to come to grips with modernization and with modernity. We need our political leaders to come to grips with the fact that they lack legitimacy. We need our intellectuals to give up what is the kind of comfortable conformity that describe most of the intellectual discourse and realize that, in fact, they have to embrace change and not simply resist it. Now, you might ask, why am I going through all of this with this commission? Well, I think the answer is that if we want to understand the roots of 9/11, and if we want to understand why terror may continue, we have to understand, in fact, what produces the kind of hostility, the anger, the sentiments that we see. We have to understand that some of this is obviously directed against the local regimes, and some of it is directed against us. Now, we are frequently accused, and this produces a lot of resentment, of having a double standard. To be sure, when that charge is made, when it's commonplace almost every place in the region, the focus is principally on Israel. But if you think that that's the sole basis of their view of a double standard on our part, then you wouldn't really capture the understanding of what really goes on in the area. We are resented in no small part because we are seen as using democracy as a tool or as a weapon. We are seen as using democracy as a tool or as a weapon against those that we don't like, but never against those that we do like. We are seen, in a sense, as mouthing the words of democracy, but then supporting regimes that are seen as being oppressive in regional terms. Now, in identifying this analytically, I'm not sitting here and suggesting that somehow we should withdraw our support for countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or others. I am saying, however, that if we're going to deal with the issue of resentment, if we're going to deal with the issue of double standards, one of the things that we're going to have to do is be more consistent in terms of what we stand for. We don't have to push any of our friends over the cliff, but we do have to be very clear about who we are, what we stand for, what is important to us. There are, in fact, as I said, Arab liberals who are saying today that what is required in their part of the world is a rule of law. What is required for them is an independent judiciary. What is required for them is a vigorous anti-corruption campaign or set of campaigns. What is required for them is tolerance of minority rights. What is required for them is transparency and accountability. What is required for them are women's rights. Now, these happen to embrace what we believe in. And one of the things that's going to be very important for us is for us to adopt a position in which it's clear that we stand with those who represent those kinds of values. Our friends in the region should know from us that we will be very clear, not only in private but in public, about supporting those groups, those reformers who are committed to these kinds of values. They should understand very well, and those in the region should understand very well, that when those groups get suppressed, we will not be silenced in response to the suppression of those groups. If 9/11 demonstrated anything for us, it demonstrated one unmistakable lesson. We can no longer be indifferent to what goes on within these societies, within the region. For a long time, we cut our own deals with some of our friends. As long as they supported us in the region or outside the region, we basically turned a blind eye to what went on in their homes. Now, at one level, it made perfect sense. But 9/11 demonstrated that there was a consequence for us. There was an effect on our security. Being indifferent to what was happening in their societies was actually a prescription for us actually not paying attention to what was required for our security. We can no longer be in a position where some of our friends, to deflect anger from themselves, deflect it onto us. Because the consequence of socializing that kind of anger, that kind of hostility, ends up being manifested in what we saw in 9/11. Now, here again, don't mistake what I'm saying to somehow think that I don't think that hard power and only soft power is the answer to terrorism. I don't believe that. I believe that the use of hard power is essential. I believe that in terms of Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups, we have to respond to them using military force. We have to demonstrate something very profound. We have to demonstrate their way doesn't work. They prey on the imagery of humiliation, and they have the answer to humiliation. We also have to demonstrate that the only thing that they will produce is more victimhood. Not success, more victims from their standpoint. They have to be seen as the embodiment of failure. There's a long history in the Middle East of trying to defy the powerful on behalf of the powerless. Osama bin Laden is the latest in a long line. Saddam tried to do that. You go back to Nasser. All tried to somehow embrace and represent the powerless by defying the powerful. Well, this becomes an argument in and of itself for us to be, I think, successful in terms of proving that they cannot succeed. Let me just sum up, since I see the red light is on, and I always respect the red light. Let me just sum up by saying the following. It is very important for us to use hard power where appropriate and necessary, but we also have to be realistic. The military cannot provide us the only answer that we need, any more than improving law enforcement, which is essential, any more improving intelligence, which is essential, any more in terms of cutting off financial flows to terrorist groups, which is essential, any more than ensuring that there aren't safe havens. All that is important. But we will have to use all of the instruments at our disposal, and we will have to press very hard to make it clear that any use of terror discredits any cause that employs it. As long as resistance is seen as being the equivalent of a normal way to deal with your cause, then we're going to find that suicide bombs are somehow seen as being legitimate. If they're legitimate in the Middle East, they're going to be legitimate anywhere else. We have to focus very heavily on how we discredit that. And in the end, we also have to create models of success. For example, in Iraq, and the last line of what I wrote was, we have to focus on how we make the power of our example as important as our military power. When we do that, we'll succeed in this war.